Friends, very good to see you again, or for you to see us. Sorry, that's an old joke, isn't it, James?
Yeah, it's terribly old now. Yeah,
But the great thing is, James laughs at my old joke. So
yeah, I know. It's almost as if I'm paid to, isn't it?
well, not exactly paid per joke, but yeah,
No.
okay, fair enough. Friends, before we go any further, just a reminder, 3 really helpful things you could do. If you're enjoying this video, click on the like button down below so that you don't miss out. Then click on the subscribe button as well, and you can join us in future weeks. And especially important, if you click on the share button down below again, and there'll also be an opportunity at the end, then you can get the link and you can post this on social media or pass it to your friends or whatever. We like it when people do that, don't we, James?
We certainly do. It helps an enormous amount to get the word out there, and new listeners are always very, very welcome.
They are indeed, from all around the world. And of
Yeah.
course, what we're trying to do is we're trying to bring the word to life. So in conversation, to explore what is going on in the Sunday lectionary gospel reading. Now, James, where have we got to in the year, in the calendar?
Yeah, we're on Trinity 4.
Well, you had to think about that, didn't you?
I did. Yeah, I did have to remember what yesterday was.
But that's usually my line, isn't it? I usually say, James, we're in Trinity 4.
Yeah.
And I say to you, what's the gospel reading this week?
Yeah. And the gospel reading is Luke 10:25-37, which, as I'm sure many of our watchers know, is the parable of the Good Samaritan.
Great. Now, I have posted a blog post in the previous post with the details about that. And I don't know how I'll actually, before we go into the details of that, I just want to ask you, as a preacher, how do you feel in tackling these kind of really, 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 really well-known stories? Are they something that inspire you in your preaching, or when you see them, do you go, oh no, not this one again?
Do you know, I don't normally go, oh no, not this one again, even though I've been in the same place 16 years and I've probably preached on many of these passages multiple times. I do have a rule though, and I don't look back on what I preached the last time. And that's because I think if you do that, you end up kind of either regurgitating with a slight amendment, or, and actually I want to try and come to this passage fresh, and say, right, okay, so what does God want to say to this congregation now through this passage? What is the message that we're looking at?
You've almost exactly recited what I've put on a previous blog post about the most important thing in preaching.
Right.
What is the most important thing in preaching is to ask, what is God saying to this congregation through this text in this moment?
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really important. Of course, when you come and look at the text and you do your text study part of your preaching process, you're inevitably going to look at things which are very familiar. But there's always the scriptures are so rich, and this passage, as we shall find in a minute, is extremely rich, isn't it? I mean, it's very, very lots of details and so on, and you will always find something which will illuminate. And just from our own walk with God, passages mean different things to us at different times in our lives. They develop meaning, as it were, or we develop understanding as we go through life. So I think there's always that freshness that is there for us. So I never have a sort of heavy heart. It's always a joy.
Good. That's great. That's great to hear. Yeah, you sound like you're almost a goodly evangelical there, James.
Well, of course, next week now I'll look at a passage and oh, really? Have I got this one again?
By the way, I never say this passage is rich. The reason for that is when I go to academic conferences, when somebody chairing a session says that paper was very rich, what they mean is it was completely incomprehensible. We got no idea what you're talking about. So that's a sort of code. That's academic code.
Yes, academic code.
But right. The passage is rich in the real sense of the word. Yeah. So, now, having said that, the parable of the Good Samaritan is extremely well known and it's very well trodden. And I make an observation on the blog post about saying, I think I've actually identified 4 common misuses of this text. And I don't know how you responded to those. I mean, the first one I said was antinomianism. That is, Jesus wants to do away with legalism. It's all about loving your neighbor. Or reductionism. Oh, Jesus only gave 2 commandments. We don't need to pay attention to anything else. Or what I call moral autorism, or from a friend of mine, a colleague of mine said, a hardening of the auteries, which is we ought to care for people. Jesus tells us what we ought to be doing. Or what I've called liberal inclusivism. The parable uses a despised outsider as a model of right action, so truth is always found in the lives of those on the margins. So I don't know how you respond to those, my observation. Do you think that's a fair... Well, it's probably slightly unfair, but I mean, have you noticed those sort of tendencies in the way the passage has been used?
I certainly have, I think. And I mean, okay, your stereotyping is a little bit, but I absolutely see the truth of those. And what's particularly interesting, of course, is that that is the way they are often used in the public mind, in the popular mind, with this parable that has phrases that are passed into English language, a Good Samaritan. That's almost, I don't think I've ever come across a use of the phrase Good Samaritan in our media that is accurate in terms of understanding of the parable. I think it's always misunderstood, the parable, when somebody, it's always just an act of kindness. It's any old act. A Good Samaritan is just any old act of kindness, completely missing so much of what's in here. So yeah, I think there are problems with that, and no, I think all of those issues, I've heard all of them, I think. Yeah.
Now, there's also the example, which I think is true and not apocryphal, of Margaret Thatcher saying that in defense of capitalism, that if the Samaritan didn't have the money, he wouldn't have been able to help the person. So that shows that Jesus thinks that wealth generation is a really good idea.
Yeah, and I've actually quoted that in a sermon on previous occasions. Yes, I have. Yeah.
With approval?
No, not with approval. No. That's my opening joke. That's one of my opening jokes. And then we sort of move on to more sane things.
Yeah, I see. Okay. Well, listen, let's just sort of plunge in. And I think before we actually get onto it, we've got, for you, dear listener, dear watcher sounds a bit odd, dear viewer, that's the thing. Yeah. We've got 7 surprises, haven't we, James, in the passage? So we'll work through them. Before we get into the first surprise, oh no, this is the first surprise. Well, the first surprise is that this question that Jesus is asked, it isn't limited to Luke's gospel, even though the story is. So if I just do a quick screen share here, make sure I pick the right one. There we go. Is that the right window? That is the right window. There we go. So it's interesting. We've got this comparison here, Matthew 22. So quite late on, actually, in Matthew's gospel. Mark 12, similar section, actually. He's in Mark 12. Jesus is already in Jerusalem, isn't he? And here earlier on, Luke 10. So just a couple of observations I noticed here, just from a quick glance. One is that, interestingly, as quite often, Mark has the longer section, more detail. Yeah. So in Jesus's answer, he actually includes the introduction to the Shema, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one, whereas actually Matthew and Luke abbreviate it slightly. And Matthew and Mark, again, you have the conclusion, additional conclusion in Mark, there is no commandment greater than these, which of course finds its way into our Anglican liturgy in a reminder of the summary of the law and instruction to confession. Now, just one thing, a couple of things I noticed. Firstly, Luke does seem to recalibrate this for perhaps a less informed Jewish audience, although interestingly, he does seem to go on to assume that his readers will know the difference between, or the tension between Jews and Samaritans. Interestingly, he finishes it with "do this and you will live," rather than language about the commandments. And the other thing I noticed from this parallel is Luke removes it from a particular context, where Matthew and Mark have a particular context of conversation and conflict. Luke starts on one occasion, which of course we've already noticed, haven't we, that in this narrative section of Luke, that he pulls together things thematically and he detaches them from a very specific context. But I don't know what else you make of the parallels here.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because in Luke, the question is slightly different. What must I do to inherit eternal life, rather than which is the greatest commandment? And of course, we always need to remind ourselves when we see that phrase "eternal life" that what it meant was the life of the age to come. Yeah. So we and that's the life of God's kingdom in all its fullness, and so on and so forth. So it's much more than just kind of living forever happily, ever after, as so much sort of Western individualism has often interpreted it. So we've got to get our heads around that. And I think, as you say, there's interesting parallel at the end there. Do this and you will live, and what that. I mean, so much rests on that word "live" there, doesn't it? That essentially, you will live in God's kingdom. You will be living in accordance with what Jesus asks of us as his followers. So I think that's quite important. But also the other thing, of course, is that Jesus turns the question towards the lawyer. So the lawyer has to answer the question, and it's a classic Jesus thing that he does, isn't it? He responds to the question by asking another question. Classic.
Yeah.
always
Well,
does
you know
that.
that joke, don't you? Why does a Jew always answer a question with a question? Answer. Tell me, why shouldn't a Jew always answer a question
Exactly.
with a question?
Yeah.
So there you go, another one of my old jokes you're laughing at. Thank you very much.
I think it's a classic device in conversation. And actually also, I mean, I think we'll come to this later on, but Jesus, in a sense, doesn't answer the question that the lawyer goes on to ask, from which the parable comes. He actually asks us a slightly different question, but that's interesting too.
Okay, great. Now, of course, the perennial question we have here is, are the differences we find the result of the gospel writers taking a core story which has been handed down orally and they're adapting it to different situations? So in other words, is this primarily what we might call a redactional emphasis, or did Jesus have this conversation on more than one occasion?
Yeah. And I mean, as we often rehearse, Jesus would given his teaching on many, many occasions to many different audiences. But I think particularly in this situation, where this, as we know, was a standard question in ancient Judaism, wasn't it? You know, what's the most important commandment? That's a standard question of a rabbi. In a sense, it gave you the rabbi's credentials, told you where they stood on the spectrum. So this would have been asked of Jesus, I suspect, many times.
Well, that then does take us on. That was our first sort of surprise. I think the other thing to notice, and this leads into exactly that point, is that, again, one of the ways in which people use this is to say, well, all those detailed commandments, particularly the ones in the Old Testament, don't matter. Whereas actually Jesus doesn't simply say, forget everything else. What he says is, how do you summarize? How do you sum up? Or we might even say, what's the interpretive key to reading all the detailed commandments in the Old Testament? And it just occurs to me that we might, for example, see the creeds in the same way. So it's not that the creeds tell us everything we need to know, because we need to know the scriptures as well, but our reading of the scriptures needs to lead us to the position that the creeds summarize. And if we have from a different direction, then, for instance, there's somebody on my blog who comments quite regularly who is clearly not a Trinitarian. And I think what the creeds tell us is that this is on the one hand, this is the hermeneutical lens through which, rightly understood, you read the scriptures. On the other hand, this is the direction that the scriptures are putting you in. We might even talk about the language of the hermeneutical circle or the hermeneutical spiral there, if people are happy with that language. But that therefore we do need to read the details, but we read the details knowing that that's where they're going. Well, that's the goal. That's the end of the goal.
Yeah. And of course, the other thing Jesus does here is he as he does so often in the Gospels, he tells us what the law looks like works out in the context in which he's living, and therefore gives us clues and understanding as to what it looks like in our own living. So I think that's a very important, and we probably come on to that later on as well.
Yeah. So here's that's our first surprise. Here's our second surprise. As you said, this was a clear subject of debate in Jesus' day.
Yes, of course, it's number 2, isn't it? Yeah.
That's right, number 2. Yeah, you're jumping ahead, James. Always ahead.
All right, I'm sorry. I'm trying to keep everything in order here.
And I just mentioned in the blog post someone who wants to be a disciple, and the story is that they go and ask these 2 major figures, Hillel and Shammai. It's probably an apocryphal story, but it's quite an interesting one. And apparently, this prospective convert goes to Shammai and says, "Can you teach me the entire Torah while standing on one leg?" And Shammai is insulted by the ridiculous request and throws him out of the house. But Hillel accepts the challenge and stands on one leg and says, "Whatever is hateful to you, do not do to your neighbor. This is the whole Torah. The rest is commentary. Go and study it." So again, the background here is exactly that kind of thing. And in fact, I know other people have said, well, look, actually, you can see in the Old Testament, there's a number of places where there seem to be some kinds of summary statements, and again, functioning as a hermeneutical key. So we do need these.
Yeah.
But by the way, did you know that scientific research shows that if you can stand on one leg for more than 10 seconds, you've got much more likely chance of living to old age?
I did, actually. Yes, this is something we could get into on another occasion, perhaps. But yes, those of us who sort of follow the gospel according to Michael Mosley, we know these things, don't we?
And it was actually in the week as well last week.
It was in the week. I saw that. Yeah.
Well, so there we go. Okay, so Shall we move on to a third surprise?
Yeah. What's the third surprise?
Well, the third surprise is the fact that this story only occurs in Luke.
Yeah. That is fascinating, isn't it?
It is, but the surprise is that this isn't a surprise. In the sense that it is, I do find it interesting. And I know we've touched on this before, that people say, well, how come? There's a question around whether the Gospels are trustworthy or reliable because they don't exactly match one another. But of course, if they did exactly match one another, we wouldn't need four. We only need one. But it is interesting that people kind of see that as a problem, where we actually need to pay attention to the fact that, Jesus may well have said these things on different occasions, but the gospel writers are being very selective. They're also being very dense. I ended up having a conversation on a tube train with somebody in London who turned out to be an English graduate. And I don't know how we ended up talking about the Gospels. And he said, well, as you know, as an English graduate, English literature, studying English literature, I find the Gospels very dense. And they are, as you say, they're rich. But because of the limitations as well, the gospel writers are very selective. And of course, part of the reason for Luke including this story in is because he has a distinctive interest, does he not, in Jewish Samaritan relations.
He does, absolutely. And I think you quote on the blog, you know, there's the other story, which is sort of bookends this one about the lepers, the 10 lepers. It's the Samaritan who comes back to thank Jesus,
which is also unique to Luke.
Yeah. And then of course in the book of Acts, he's particularly interested in the response of Samaritans to the gospel and how the Spirit is poured out on them as well. So it's definitely a particular interest. And I suppose the other thing is that when we think about the Good Samaritan, we think, well, it's, you know, maybe everybody's favorite parable or some people's favorite parable. And you think, well, why isn't my favorite parable in all four Gospels? Because surely it was popular in the ancient church. Well, actually, of course, that's not the case, is it? I mean, things are, you know, if you ask Luke, what's your favorite parable? I don't know what he would have said. We have no idea, you know. So it's almost what people feel insulted that their favorite thing is not everywhere. But no, Luke has particular emphases, like the other gospel writers do. But Luke's I think, particularly distinctive, aren't they? And this whole thing about Samaritans and the difficult relationship that there was between Jews and Samaritans in the ancient world.
So does this mean that this Samaritan figure is code for the marginalized, the outsider? Therefore, if we're going to retell the story today, we simply say, I remember in the 1970s or 80s, Riding Lights Theatre Company, they did the train from London to York, and it was a good punk rocker.
It was, yeah.
Is that a good way to retell the story?
Yeah, I'm not sure it is actually, because I think you can say that, and you can probably, you know, people can probably get away with it. But if you think about Jews and Samaritans, they both came from the same ethnic roots, didn't they? And their beliefs were very similar. The problem here is not so much marginalization, but similarity, which is one of those awkward similarities, which is you're just close enough to be at loggerheads with one another because of the things that you believe are slightly different. And this has really been pointed out in, I think, the chapter before, where Jesus, you know, they go through the Samaritan villages and they won't receive Jesus because he's set his face to Jerusalem, not to Samaria. And of course, that dispute over where God was supposed to be worshipped, Samaria or Jerusalem, is one of those little disputes which are actually huge in the context. So
this is a family feud more than
I think it's a family feud. It's people are a bit nearer to us. And somebody on your blog suggested, and this is an interesting idea, that we could replace it by the good Muslim.
Yes, they did.
And I thought that's interesting, isn't it? Because in a sense, I suppose what they were trying to do in suggesting that is suggesting that we're both monotheists, as it were. That we have quite a bit in common. Though, of course, culturally we often don't really. But I think that was an interesting attempt to try and get to this closeness rather than this distance.
We've also noticed that, and again, we've touched on this before, that quite often people look at Luke's gospel and say, well, Luke is really concerned about the marginalized and the outsider. But he's actually also concerned about the insider and the pious Jew and the respectable. So it is much, and the wealthy. So it's about the rich and the poor. It's about the Jew and the Samaritan and the Gentile. It's actually both and rather than the other. But that does lead into our fourth surprise. And this is a comment actually that was made 3 years ago when we talked about this passage before, and I talked about it on the blog by Alistair Roberts, who highlights, and he actually goes into some detail in 2 Chronicles 28, where there's a passage about reconciliation between the Judeans in the south on the one hand and the Samaritans, the 10 tribes in the north as well. So we actually have, as you say, this sort of family dispute. And he ends up saying, well, look, in that case, if this is true, if it's about the inclusion of the Samaritans within the blessings of the new covenant, particularly when we see in Acts 8, again, the gospel coming to the Samaritans, he says the question that Jesus is inviting us to ask is not so much, who is my neighbor? Well, of course, he actually inverts that. It's not the lawyer says, who's my neighbor? Jesus says, well, who's being the neighbor to the other? But actually, if this family issue, the relationship between Jews and Samaritans is as important as it appears to be for Luke, the question we're asked is, how am I going to be part of the restoration of the people of God, a restoration that takes place in the relationship between the Good Samaritan and the Judean, these groups that have formerly been at enmity with one another? And of course, that then connects with the language that sort of Paul has in Ephesians chapter 2 about, the gospel is preached to those who are near Jews
and those who are far off.
And those who are far off. And because enmity has been ended,
broken down.
Exactly so. And because we've been turned from enemies to friends with God, we're also then turned from enemies to friends with others who are incorporated into this new covenant. Shall we keep going?
Go on. Let's we're getting there, aren't we?
Our fifth little surprise is again that the parable isn't actually contrasting legalism with compassion.
No.
Because of course, the summary of the law, the second part of it, well, the first part of it, well, both the summaries of the law are from the Torah, of course. I think we don't struggle so much with the first one, which is from Deuteronomy 6, verse 4. The Lord our God is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind. People don't notice that the second part actually comes from Leviticus 19, which I think just as a little nudge to us, because of course Leviticus 19 is one chapter after Leviticus 18 with all those prohibited relationships and this concern with sexual morality. So it seems to me the issue is not compassion versus the law, but the right understanding of the law.
And particularly it seems to me what it looks like in terms of how it's lived. That's what the Samaritan shows us in contrast to the priest and the Levite, isn't it?
And Alistair Roberts picks up another really interesting reflection. He says this is almost like Jesus is offering a commentary on Hosea 6:6. For I desire mercy or loving faithfulness, chesed, not sacrifice, the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Now, again, you've got this Semitic sort of not one but the other, meaning, yes, this is important, but it's not as important as this. Or if you've missed the other, then you've missed the point. So this isn't simply ditching all the commandments, but it's saying, look, this is the heart of it. And if you've missed this, you've missed the point. And again, really interesting observation, which Alistair makes, is that why the mention of oil and wine? Well, in the Old Testament, oil and wine is what you put on a sacrifice. So in a sense, the true sacrifice is the Samaritan's action. It's almost as if the care he offers for this wounded man is his sacrifice, his sweet-smelling sacrifice to God.
Yes, and it's a theme that you is there in Psalm 51 as well, I think, isn't it? In that bit where towards the end where David says, if you have no delight in sacrifice, if I were to give a burnt offering, you would not be pleased. Yeah. The sacrifice acceptable God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart, O God, you will not despise. And then the very next verse, then you will delight in right sacrifices, in burnt offerings and whole burnt offerings.
And scholars quite often say these two things must have been written by different people.
Yeah.
Of which I don't think there's any textual evidence.
No. Interesting.
Okie. Now we come on to our sixth surprise, and there's a couple of, well, it's a sort of a double surprise really. And one of the things I just noticed is that people might be familiar with the allegorical reading of this, which actually started with Origen, because of course Origen was interested in the different meanings of the text. And the man who goes down is Adam. Jerusalem is paradise. Jericho is the world. The robbers are hostile powers. The priest is the law. The Levite is the prophets. The Samaritan is Christ. The wounds are disobedience. The beast of burden, the donkey, is the Lord's body. The inn where the Samaritan leaves the man is the church. The manager of the inn is the bishop.
Yes, that's Origen, isn't it?
And the fact that the Samaritan promises he'll return represents Christ's second coming. Is that an attractive way to read to you?
It's very, very weird, isn't it?
It's certainly weird to the modern mind.
It is to edge of the modern mind, and of course, it's very difficult to put ourselves back in that time. Yeah, very weird to the modern mind, because it feels like we're not giving the story its own life.
No, and it detaches it from its context. And I think, again, the real problem here is that something I've talked about before, it feels to me to be potentially quite an anti-Semitic reading, because it says Jesus good, Jewish law bad.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to be what Jesus is saying at all. No. Now, as a bit of a counter to that, I've offered another weird reading, which we also find difficult to get our heads around, but which I think is there in the text. That is Luke's careful approach to numerical composition.
Yes.
Because I point out there are 3 places. Well, I didn't point to that. This is something that Michael Parsons points out, and he gets it in turn from somebody else. But the fact that in 3 episodes, the raising of the widow's son, this parable here, and then the parable of the 2 sons, and thinking about the parable of the prodigal son, in each case, the word he had compassion, splanknisthomai, great word, literally his bowels were moved, comes at the numerical center of the passage. So that seems to me to be significant, because there's a parallel between Jesus's compassion for the widow on the one hand, and the Samaritan's compassion for this beaten up man.
Yeah, I think it's hugely interesting, and we know that Luke is very, very careful in his composition. He composes poetically very often, chiastically, as we've spoken about before. So he's careful about where he puts the words. So it seems to be an entirely legitimate way of looking at the text, actually.
And for me, that does put, just again, this one of my old jokes you'll laugh at, when the boy in Sunday school and the teacher says, you know, what's grey and has a bushy tail and bears nuts for the winter, and the boy says, I know the answer is always Jesus, but it sure sounds like a squirrel to me. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay.
We had that last week. Didn't we have that last week as well?
We probably did. I know we did. Sorry, it keeps coming in.
I can only do a laugh once a week, you know.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. But here's the thing, and I express it like this in the blog. We might then want to reflect and further understand theologically that, beaten and bruised as we have been by sin, it is Jesus who's refused to pass by on the other side. But has brought us help and healing by paying the price that was needed for us. Now, I don't think I'm lapsing into allegorical reading of the passage, but it does seem to me that the practical lesson of the parable of the Good Samaritan is that in following his example of loving neighbor, we're not just being social activists. We're not having a hardening of the arteries. We're not rejecting law. What we're doing is we're giving to others what has been given to us.
Yes.
So
and we're fulfilling and we're fulfilling that fundamental of Christian life, which is to be like Jesus. So, you know, he is the perfect example. So I think that's why, for me, that reading is really helpful and convincing, because it fulfills that criteria, doesn't it? So, you know, being like Jesus is the whole of Christianity, really. And if you're going to be like the Good Samaritan, well, then the Good Samaritan is like Jesus. So,
Now, that was the 6th one, the last little 7th one. Did you enjoy my little 7th?
Yeah, always happy with numbers. Yeah.
But then the final one, little bonus.
The final one was wonderful, yes, because you managed to get back onto your favourite topic, which is the birth narratives in Luke, and there wasn't an in. So, exactly so. You managed to entirely justify the entire 25 minutes that we spent here.
Exactly so. So the word for in here is pandokeon.
Yeah.
And the word occurs nowhere in the birth narrative in Luke 2, where the room is a kataluma, an upper guest room, which just goes to demonstrate that Jesus was not born in a stable. There we go.
Yes.
James, great to chat with you, friends.
Good to see you.
Thank you for joining us. I hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget to do those 3 wonderful things. Click the like button, subscribe so you don't miss out, and do click on the share link so you can pass it on to others. James, great to see you, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Yes.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.